Family doesn't keep score. Winifred's voice cut straight through the sharp scrape of silver forks against porcelain plates. She sat perfectly straight at the head of the table, raising her crystal water glass directly beneath the harsh yellow glare of the Edison bulb. The heavy smell of her chicken casserole, thick with melted butter, roasted sage, and caramelized onions, hung stagnant in the dining room air. "That's what Earl always said," she continued, her gaze sweeping past me like I was a piece of invisible furniture. "You give because you love, not because you want credit." I kept my smile exactly where it was. Earl was a wise man. "He was," she said, not missing a single beat. "He provided for this family. That's what Holbrook men do. They build." Under the table, my left hand curled into a tight fist against my thigh. My right hand rested completely flat on the white linen napkin. The silver band of my mother's old Timex watch pressed cold against my wrist. I glanced down. 6:47 in the evening. 10 years since my mother passed away. She used to sit at the wrong end of the table near the kitchen, too. Dolores Campbell leaned across the granite countertop, the countertop I paid for 2 years ago. "Sasha, that casserole dish you brought is just wonderful." Winifred smiled her sweetest, most practiced smile. "Oh, Sasha always brings something. She is so good at contributing little things." My jaw tightened until the back of my teeth ached. There were 8 people sitting around this table tonight. 8 people eating on the hardwood floors I purchased under the new roof. I spent $12,400 repairing just last October. And for 9 years, I had swallowed these little remarks, absorbing them the way a sponge takes on dirty water. After dessert, I carried the stacked porcelain plates into the kitchen. The hot water rushed from the faucet loud and steaming, foaming up the white dish soap over my hands. I heard Trevor push his chair back in the dining room. "Sit down, baby," Winifred's voice floated clearly over the sound of the running water. "Let Sasha handle it." "She likes to keep her hands busy," Mrs. Campbell chimed in right on cue. "You raised 2 good boys, Winnie." "I try," Winifred replied, raising her voice just enough to ensure the sound carried through the open kitchen doorway. "Lord knows I try. Not everyone who walks into this family understands what it means to be a Holbrook." Trevor stepped into the kitchen a moment later. His large hands gripped an empty water glass, his knuckles straining white against the glass. "She doesn't mean it like that," he murmured, standing close to the sink, but not offering to take a single plate. I turned the hot water off, reached for the hand towel hanging on the oven door, the towel I bought, and dried my hands. "She means exactly that. She has been meaning it for 9 years. He looked down at the floor. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to not ask me that question, like I am the one with the problem." Trevor opened his mouth, closed it, and tightened his grip on the glass. He turned around and walked back out to the living room, choosing the path of least resistance. He always chose the peace. The drive home down the mountain was dark. A heavy fog rolled across the asphalt, leaving nothing but the glow of the headlights and the broken white lines passing by. Trevor kept both hands on the steering wheel, wrapped in his familiar heavy silence. I reached forward and popped open the glove box, took out the small spiral-bound notebook and a black pen. March 9th, Sunday dinner. Cabin roof bill paid last October, $12,400. Winifred's word count about Holbrook men providing 7. Winifred's word count, acknowledging Sasha, 0. I snapped the notebook shut and shoved it back into the dark compartment. Trevor did not ask what I was writing. He never asked. Monday morning brought the harsh hum of fluorescent lights and the sharp, bitter smell of stale coffee brewing in the break room. I sat at my desk at Dalton & Associates, spreading a thick stack of printed financial statements across the polished wood. Mrs. Ida Purnell sat across from me. She was 67 years old, clutching her purse in her lap, her eyes wide and wet as she stared at the papers her late husband had left behind. "My husband handled all of this," Ida whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't even know what half these words mean. It is just a mess." I picked up my pen and pointed to the top line of the first page. I kept my voice low, steady, and entirely free of judgment. "That is what I am here for. We will go line by line. There is absolutely no rush." Ida let out a long breath, her shoulders dropping an inch. "You are so patient. Your family must be so lucky to have you." I offered a small, polite smile and returned my focus to the numbers. I managed over $2 million in assets for this firm. Clients trusted me with their life savings. Colleagues asked for my advice when complex portfolios unraveled. In this office, my words carried weight. But at that dining room table in the mountains, I was just the woman who brought the side dish. Bree Kelton walked into my office right after Ida left. She carried a fresh cup of coffee, pausing in the doorway to study my expression. "You have got that Winifred face again." I do not have a Winifred face, I said, stacking Ida's folders. Bree took a sip from her mug. You have worn it every Monday morning for 9 years. It is your most consistent feature. That night, the house was quiet except for the muffled voice of a sports announcer coming through the drywall from the living room. Trevor was watching a game. I sat in my small home office, staring at the drooping leaves of a potted ficus I kept forgetting to water. I reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, lifted out a thick manila folder labeled Holbrook Personal. Inside sat a single, silver USB drive. The laptop screen cast a cold blue light across my hands as I plugged it in. The spreadsheet opened instantly. 9 separate tabs along the bottom, one for every year of my marriage. Columns neatly labeled: date, recipient, amount, category, payment method, notes. I clicked on the current year and typed in a new row. March 9th. Winifred. Cabin maintenance roof repair. $12,400. Paid October last year from Chase checking account ending in 4471. Winifred unaware. The cell at the bottom of the page automatically updated. The grand total across all 9 sheets stared back at me in bold black numbers. $341,200. I stared at the blinking cursor. I did not start this ledger during our first year of marriage because I wanted to track what I gave. I started it because a cold, quiet panic had settled in my chest. I was terrified that one day, when I needed proof that I actually existed in this family, bank receipts would be the only language any of them would understand. I ejected the drive, dropped it back into the folder, and locked the drawer. The small brass key hung on the same ring as my office keys. Saturday morning up in Blue Ridge carried a sharp chill. We sat around the table on the back porch of the cabin. Just the 4 of us this time. Trevor, Kyle, Winifred, and me. Thick white steam spiraled up from my coffee mug. A blue jay shrieked from the branches of the old oak tree near the driveway. The wooden floorboards groaned out loud when Kyle pushed his chair back to stretch his legs. Winifred wore a pastel lavender cardigan. Her heavy silver bracelets clinked together like wind chimes when she reached across the table for the jar of blackberry jam. She had a very specific look on her face today. Over 9 years, I had learned to recognize her announcement face. Whenever she wanted to declare something important, she waited until the exact middle of the meal when everyone was eating and no one could easily walk away. She set her knife down on the edge of her plate. I have been thinking a lot about the future lately. About what happens to this beautiful place after I am gone. Trevor stopped chewing. Mom, no, let me finish, she insisted, waving a hand in the air. I talked to Harold Ennis this week. You know Harold from church. He is a lawyer. I am starting my will. This cabin, it goes to my grandchildren, future Holbrooks. Kyle grabbed a piece of toast. That is really nice, Mom. Winifred turned her head slowly, fixing her pale eyes directly on me. I want to make absolutely sure it stays in the family. Blood family. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden table. I moved my hand slowly with total control. The ceramic base hit the wood without making a single sound. Blood family. 2 words. 9 years of marriage. $341,000 drained from my premarital savings. I paid for the very roof over her head. I paid for the chemotherapy treatments that kept her alive. I paid off Kyle's massive student loans so he would not get evicted. And I was still not blood family. Trevor looked at me from across the table. I looked back at him. He saw something shift behind my eyes. It was not anger, and it was not tears. It was the final flicker of a hope I had kept burning for nearly a decade. It simply blinked out. Sasha, Trevor whispered, his voice laced with sudden panic. Are you okay? I offered him a perfect hollow smile. I am fine. She was sitting there giving away a house she did not even own, to grandchildren that did not exist yet. She hired a lawyer to write a will for a property with a deed that had my name printed on the top line. I turned my gaze out toward the rolling blue mountains in the distance. The low-hanging morning fog draped over the dark green pines. It was a beautiful view. I bought that view. I bought this porch. I bought the very table where she currently sat, declaring her supreme ownership of my property. Something fundamental broke inside me right then. For 9 years, I convinced myself that my silence was an act of grace, that taking the high road meant keeping my mouth shut and letting my actions speak. But looking at Winifred's smug, satisfied face, the truth finally landed. Silence was not grace. Silence was surrender. The car ride back to Savannah was suffocating. Trevor gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, wrapped in the same useless quiet he always wore when his mother crossed the line. I reached out toward the glove box. My fingers brushed the plastic latch. Then I stopped. I did not open it. I did not pull out the little notebook to write down another slight. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed Bree's number. She answered on the second ring. "I need you to clear your entire schedule this Saturday," I said, staring out the passenger window at the passing trees. "I am going to show you something I have never shown anyone else." Trevor glanced over at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who are you calling a friend?" I replied. It was the very first time in 9 years of marriage that I did not tell my husband exactly what I was doing, and as the silence stretched between us for the rest of the drive, I watched the realization dawn on his face. There were parts of my life he had no access to anymore. It was Tuesday evening when the weight of the phone call to Bree finally settled deep into my bones. The kitchen was entirely quiet, except for the low simmer of marinara sauce on the back burner. I stood at the stove, a wooden spoon resting lightly in my palm. Trevor was running late at the construction site. The house felt vacant, possessing the kind of emptiness that leaves far too much room for old memories to echo against the walls. I stared down at the bubbling red sauce, but what I actually saw was a Tuesday night in 2021. The phone had rung right around this time. Kyle's name had flashed bright across Trevor's screen. Trevor's brother had been pacing his cramped apartment, his voice frantic and vibrating through the small phone speaker. He was in trouble. Serious financial trouble. The student loan companies were preparing to garnish his restaurant manager paycheck. $76,000 of accumulated debt had finally caught up with him, threatening to pull him under. I remembered the exact way Trevor had looked at me across our granite kitchen island. His eyes were wide, silently asking a desperate question he did not have the courage to say out loud. I had simply nodded. I told my husband to do it because Kyle was his family. 3 weeks later, Kyle called back. I was standing in this exact same spot by the stove. He told Trevor that he did not know what to say. He told my husband that he had saved his life. Then right before hanging up the call, Kyle tossed out a casual afterthought. "Tell Sasha thanks too." 4 words. 4 careless words tacked onto the very end of a phone call. It was the only time in 9 years that anyone in the Holbrook family acknowledged I was even in the room when a massive check was written. And even then, it was Trevor who received the profound gratitude first. I placed the wooden spoon on the counter and looked down at my hands. The skin across my knuckles was dry from washing dishes. These were the exact same hands that signed the bank transfer for $76,000 to save Kyle from eviction. The same hands that signed the $84,000 check for Winifred's cancer treatments when she realized her insurance would not cover the mounting bills. The same hands that signed the warranty deed for a cabin on a mountain. Yet to the people sitting around that Sunday dinner table, these hands were only good for carrying a warm casserole dish out of the kitchen. Saturday morning arrived, wrapped in a thick gray coastal overcast. I drove to Bree's apartment on the east side of Savannah. Her place was small, practical, and smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and vanilla wax. Heavy textbooks on financial planning and tax law lined the wooden shelves covering her living room wall. At the small kitchen table, her daughter Ivy was quietly dragging a pink crayon across a piece of construction paper. Ivy was 8 years old, lost in her own colorful world. Bree poured 2 mugs of dark coffee and sat down across from me. I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out the heavy manila folder. I spread the printed spreadsheet across the scarred wood of her table. Next to it, I placed a certified copy of a legal document. Bree adjusted her glasses and picked up the thick, watermarked paper. She read the top line out loud. Holbrook Haven Limited Liability Company. Sole member Sasha C. Holbrook. Filed in 2018. She lowered the paper and stared at me over the rim of her glasses. She asked if I had actually bought the cabin through a corporate entity. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I explained that my professional financial planner brain simply would not allow me to pour $180,000 of the savings I built before my marriage into a piece of real estate without protecting the asset. Bree leaned back in her chair, the wooden joints creaking under the sudden shift in weight. She pointed out that Winifred had absolutely no idea. I nodded in agreement. Winifred firmly believed the cabin was the ancestral Holbrook family home. She had never asked to see a deed or a title because she simply assumed her successful son provided everything. Bree tapped her fingernail against her ceramic mug. She asked about Trevor. I kept my voice perfectly level. Trevor knew. He had always known. The air in the small kitchen seemed to grow incredibly heavy. Bree set her mug down and leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. She spoke my name slowly, letting the syllables hang in the quiet space between us. She laid out the harsh reality I had been avoiding. My mother-in-law was actively writing a legal will to give away a house that belonged entirely to me, and my husband was standing by letting it happen. This was not about Winifred anymore. This was about Trevor. I turned my head and watched little Ivy at the end of the table. She was drawing two stick figures, two women holding hands under a bright yellow sun. I had always wanted a family like that, a family that held hands and protected each other fiercely. Instead, I had married into a family that only held receipts. Saturday night brought a suffocating stillness to our bedroom. The yellow light from the bedside lamp cast long, distorted shadows across the carpet. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I had just showered and the ends of my wet hair dripped cold water against the back of my neck. My mother's silver Timex watch rested on the wooden nightstand, ticking loudly in the quiet room. Trevor stood near the closet, quietly unbuttoning his blue work shirt. I watched his reflection in the mirror for a long moment before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, clear, and measured. It was the exact tone I used when explaining a failing portfolio to a nervous client. I told him his mother was planning to leave a cabin she did not own to grandchildren we did not have. Trevor paused. His fingers stopped on the third button of his shirt. He did not turn around. He said she was just planning that it was not real yet. I kept my eyes fixed on his broad shoulders in the mirror. I reminded him that she had hired Harold Ennis, which made it very real. Trevor let out a heavy sigh, finally turning to face me. He promised he would talk to her. The promise sounded hollow and entirely practiced. I told him he had been saying those exact words for 9 years. He dropped his hands to his sides, the partially unbuttoned shirt hanging loose around his frame. He asked me what I actually wanted him to do. Did I want him to walk into her house and tell her the cabin she had been living in belonged to his wife? He shook his head, his voice tightening. He said it would completely destroy her. I stood up from the mattress. I looked at the man I had married, studying the deep lines around his eyes. I asked him what he thought she had been doing to me. Trevor slowly walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. We were separated by maybe 2 feet of physical space, but the distance between us stretched across 9 years of unsaid truths. He looked down at the carpet. He spoke in a quiet, ragged whisper. He told me he knew what I had done for his family. He knew exactly how much I had given them over the years. Then he looked up, his eyes pleading. He asked if I could just give him a little more time. The ticking of the Timex on the nightstand seemed to grow remarkably loud. Give me more time. That was what my husband always said. More time, more patience, more grace. And every single year that I gave it to him, I became a little smaller, a little more invisible, a little more like my own mother, fading into the wallpaper while everyone else took the credit for her quiet sacrifices. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached over and clicked off the yellow lamp. I lay down and turned my back to him. The darkness swallowed the room completely. I could hear Trevor's shallow breathing. He knew I was not asleep. I knew he was wide awake. But lying there in the dark, staring at the shadows on the wall, a brand new thought finally crystallized in my mind. I did not need his permission to be seen. The very next morning, while Trevor was outside mowing the lawn, I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Harold Ennis. I did not call to demand that he stop writing Winifred's will. I called to ask a specific hypothetical question about property law in the state of Georgia. I needed to understand exactly what legal rights a tenant had over a property owned by a separate limited liability company funded entirely by a single member. The lawyer's answer was brief and absolute. Nothing. She had absolutely no rights at all. Monday evening found me sitting alone in my office at Dalton & Associates, long after the cleaning crew had emptied the wastebaskets and turned off the hallway lights. The heavy silence of the commercial building pressed against the glass of my door. I did not stay late to review client portfolios or analyze market trends. My financial planner brain simply took over when the emotional weight of my marriage became too heavy to carry. When I could not find the right words to explain the quiet devastation of the weekend, I turned to the only language that had never lied to me. I turned to the numbers. I opened the secure portal to my Chase checking account. This was the account I opened 3 years before I ever met Trevor, the one I had carefully maintained completely separate from our joint household finances. The soft blue glow of the computer monitor illuminated the dark mahogany wood of my desk. I set the date range filter back to 2016. I began to print. The heavy commercial printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, churning out page after page of bank statements. I took a bright yellow highlighter from my desk drawer. I went through the pages line by line, uncapping the marker and dragging it across every single transaction that involved the Holbrook family. The fluorescent yellow ink bled slightly into the thick white paper. I highlighted the transfer for $84,000, the exact amount sent directly to the oncology billing department, when Winifred discovered her premium insurance policy would not cover her experimental cancer treatments. I highlighted the series of payments totaling $76,000, the money that saved Kyle from having his wages garnished and losing his apartment. I marked the down payment for the cabin in Blue Ridge. I marked the $12,400 roofing repair from last October. By the time I finished, my fingers were stained with yellow ink, and 18 specific receipts sat in a neat, undeniable stack on my desk. I gathered the papers into a thick leather folder. On Tuesday night, I drove across town to a 24-hour printing and shipping center. The parking lot was entirely empty except for my sedan and a delivery truck idling near the back alley. Inside, the store smelled sharply of hot toner, melting plastic, and old coffee. The harsh overhead lighting made my eyes ache. I stood in front of a massive industrial copy machine. I lifted the heavy plastic lid. I placed the first bank statement face down on the cool glass. I pressed the bright green button. A brilliant bar of light swept across the glass, accompanied by a deep mechanical groan from inside the machine. I repeated the process 18 times. Place the paper. Close the lid. Press the button. Watch the light. It was a repetitive, mindless physical action that kept my hands busy while my mind raced. The machine pushed out warm, freshly printed copies into the plastic receiving tray. I gathered the warm sheets and carried them over to the front counter. A tired-looking woman with a silver name tag identifying her as a notary public stamped each of the 18 copies. Her heavy metal stamp hit the counter with a loud, rhythmic thud, 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 thud. She did not ask why I needed 18 bank records certified at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. She simply signed her name in blue ink and pushed the stack back across the laminate counter. I carried the certified copies out to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, without turning the key in the ignition. The manila envelope rested on the passenger seat, containing the exact sum of $341,200. I gripped the steering wheel. I told myself I was not building a weapon. I was simply organizing the truth. There was a profound difference between the two. At least that was the story I whispered into the quiet interior of my car while staring at the yellow glow of the streetlights. But deep in my chest, a cold and steady realization had finally taken root. I was preparing for something entirely irreversible. Thursday evening arrived with a heavy rainstorm sweeping off the Georgia coast. I was standing in my kitchen slicing a green apple on the cutting board when my cell phone vibrated against the granite counter. The screen lit up with Kyle's name. Trevor was upstairs taking a shower. The house echoed with the sound of rushing water through the pipes. I dried my hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button and lifted the speaker to my ear. "Sash, hey," Kyle said. His voice carried that familiar, casual charm he always used when he needed a favor. It was a smooth, easy tone that assumed the world would naturally bend to accommodate him. "How is it going?" "Hello, Kyle," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. He did not pause to ask about my day. He launched straight into his practiced routine. "Listen, my transmission is completely shot. The mechanic says it is going to cost $2,800 to rebuild the whole thing. I know it is a lot, but you know I am good for it." I looked out the kitchen window at the rain hitting the dark glass. 9 years of history rushed through my mind. 9 years of covering the gaps, quietly paying the bills, and stepping in whenever a Holbrook man stumbled. I thought about the $76,000 I had already paid for his education. I thought about how he had called my husband to thank him for my money. I took a slow breath. The air in my lungs felt remarkably clear. "No," I said. The line went completely dead silent. Only the faint crackle of static broke the quiet. Kyle had never heard me say that word. No one in the Holbrook family had ever heard me refuse a request. What he finally stammered, his charming tone slipping away to reveal genuine confusion. "No, Kyle," I repeated, enunciating each syllable with perfect clarity. "I cannot help you this time." Seriously, his voice jumped an octave, pitching into sudden defensiveness. "It is $2,800, Sasha. That is absolutely nothing for you." My grip on the phone tightened, but my voice remained as steady as a ticking clock. "Then it should be nothing for you, too." I ended the call. I did not wait for his sputtering response. I placed the phone gently back down on the granite counter. My heart beat against my ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm. The kitchen felt exactly the same, yet the entire foundation of my marriage had just violently shifted. 10 minutes later, the water stopped running upstairs. I heard Trevor walking heavily across the bedroom floor. A moment later, my phone vibrated again. It was my husband. He was standing directly above my head on the second floor, calling my cell phone. I answered on the first ring. "Kyle just called me," Trevor said. His voice was tight, strained with the effort of holding back an argument. He said you turned him down. I did, I confirmed, staring at the sliced apple on the cutting board. Sasha, his car is broken down. He needs that car to get to work. Trevor let out a heavy sigh, the sound of a man who believed he was being incredibly reasonable. He is my brother. The cold thing that had been sleeping behind my ribs suddenly woke up. It did not roar or scream. It simply straightened its spine. And I am your wife, I told him, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I have been both your wife and his bank account for 9 years. You need to pick which one you remember first. I hung up the phone for the second time that evening. I did not go upstairs. Trevor did not come down to the kitchen. We spent the rest of the night in the exact same house, separated by a ceiling, and a silence that felt heavier than the rain pounding against the roof. Friday brought a sharp, clear sky and a demanding schedule at the office. By the time lunch arrived, I was completely exhausted. I walked into the employee break room holding a plastic container of mixed greens. The room smelled faintly of roasted almonds and balsamic vinaigrette. The large industrial refrigerator hummed loudly in the corner. I sat down at the small circular table near the window. I did not look at my phone. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. It was the official operating agreement for Holbrook Haven Limited Liability Company. I placed the document next to my salad and began reading through the standard legal clauses, tracing the lines of text with the tip of my pen. Bree walked into the break room, holding a ceramic mug of hot tea. She stopped halfway to the table, her sharp eyes locking onto the legal document resting next to my lunch. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply pointed at the paper. You are certifying bank receipts, Bree stated, her voice brisk and devoid of any small talk. You are saying no to Kyle for the very first time in your life, and now you are reading corporate operating agreements while eating a salad on a Friday afternoon. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Sasha, what exactly is the plan? I set my pen down on the table. The plastic barrel clicked sharply against the wood. I do not have a plan. Bree raised an eyebrow. The expression on her face clearly indicated she was not buying a single word I was saying. Girl, you have 18 certified receipts sitting in a folder on your desk. You have a warranty deed for a mountain cabin. That is a plan. You just have not admitted it to yourself yet. I looked away, staring out the break room window at the traffic, moving along the street below. Cars moving in orderly lines following the rules, staying inside the painted markers. I had stayed inside the lines for 9 years. I had followed every unwritten rule the Holbrook family demanded. I just want them to know the truth, I whispered, the admission slipping out before I could stop it. I want Winifred to stop telling people I am a thief. I want Trevor to finally stand up. I just want them to accept me. Bree set her tea down. The ceramic mug hit the table with a firm, solid thud. She reached across the small table and placed her warm hand directly over my cold fingers. Her grip was tight and grounding. You do not want their acceptance, Bree said, her voice dropping all of its usual sharp edges. You want your mother to see you. The breath left my lungs in a sudden violent rush. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. My mother, Ruby Cole, a woman who spent 31 years of her life cooking, cleaning, and quietly fading into the background of our childhood home. A woman who gave away every piece of herself until there was absolutely nothing left. On her deathbed, she had gripped my hand with frail, trembling fingers and begged me not to be like her. She had begged me not to give everything away and keep nothing for myself. And for 9 years, I had done exactly what I promised her I would never do. I stared at Bree, completely unable to form a single word. My throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. Bree squeezed my hand gently. I am sorry, Sasha. I know that hurts. But someone had to say it out loud. The hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet space between us. Bree did not look away, and she did not apologize again. She simply sat there holding my hand, anchoring me to the present moment while the ghosts of my past tore through the carefully constructed walls of my professional life. Bree was absolutely right. I was not fighting Winifred Holbrook. I was not fighting Trevor's cowardice or Kyle's entitlement. I was fighting the ghost of Ruby Cole. I was fighting the terrifying realization that I had spent nearly a decade paying hundreds of thousands of dollars just to ensure I did not disappear the way my mother had. I wanted my dead mother to look down and see that her daughter was important, that her daughter was necessary. I pulled my hand back slowly. I reached out and closed the thick legal document on the table. I finally understood the truth. Acceptance from people who possessed absolutely no capacity for gratitude was a completely worthless currency. I had been paying a massive premium for an insurance policy that did not actually exist. I picked up my pen and slid the papers back into my briefcase. The metallic snap of the leather closure echoed sharply in the small room. I stood up from the table. My legs felt remarkably steady. The paralyzing confusion that had clouded my mind for the past week completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. Bree watched me stand. She picked up her tea, her eyes studying my face. She knew better than to ask what I was going to do next. The answer was already written in the quiet, deliberate way I gathered my belongings. The ledger was no longer just a collection of numbers. It was a mirror. And I was finally ready to make the entire Holbrook family look into it. The heavy clarity that settled over me in the break room carried me through the rest of the workday and followed me all the way back to my quiet house. I did not stop at the grocery store. I did not turn on the radio in my car. I drove in complete silence, my mind organizing the scattered pieces of my life with the same cold precision I applied to my clients' failing retirement portfolios. By the time the sun dipped below the Savannah tree line on Tuesday evening, I was sitting in my home office with a brand new empty binder resting on the center of my desk. It was a thick, black commercial binder exactly 2 inches wide. The stiff spine cracked sharply when I opened it and laid it flat against the mahogany wood. I placed a stack of clear plastic protective sleeves to my left and a set of bright blue index tabs to my right. For 9 years, I had allowed my contributions to be treated like scattered, insignificant favors. I had allowed Winifred to rewrite the history of her own survival and comfort. That ended tonight. If the Holbrook family wanted to talk about a legacy, I was going to provide them with the exact documentation of who actually paid for it. I picked up the first document and slid it carefully into a plastic sleeve. It was the official operating agreement for Holbrook Haven Limited Liability Company, stamped and filed with the Georgia Secretary of State in 2018. The text clearly listed the sole member of the corporation, Sasha C. Holbrook. There were no other names on the paper. There were no shared interests or joint tenancies. Behind the operating agreement, I placed the financial proof of purchase. I had printed the complete transaction history from my personal Chase checking account, the one ending in 4471. I opened this specific account in 2014, 3 full years before I ever walked down the aisle and tied my life to Trevor Holbrook. I had never commingled a single penny of marital funds into that account. Every dollar that went toward the purchase of the cabin on Ridgeline Trail came directly from my premarital savings. I attached a bright blue tab to the edge of the plastic sleeve, marking the exact legal boundary that Winifred Holbrook could never cross. The next section of the binder held the warranty deed for the cabin perfectly executed and recorded in the county courthouse. I followed that with a pristine copy of the certificate of title. The paper was completely clean. There were no liens against the property. There were no co-owners listed anywhere in the margins. There were absolutely no encumbrances. The house belonged to the company, and the company belonged entirely to me. Then came the heavy part. I picked up the 18 certified bank receipts I had copied and notarized the night before. I slid each one into its own individual protective sleeve. I placed a yellow sticky note on the upper right corner of the first major medical payment. $84,000 for Winifred's oncology bills paid directly to the hospital billing department when her premium insurance failed to cover the experimental treatments. I smoothed my hand over the plastic. I added the records for Kyle's student loans. $76,000 transferred in a series of desperate payments to stop his wages from being garnished. I added the cabin mortgage statements, the property tax records, the receipts for the granite countertops, and the $12,400 invoice for the new roof installed last October. Finally, I inserted the 9 years of highlighted bank statements, the bright yellow marker bleeding slightly through the white paper, illuminating every single transaction that flowed from my personal accounts into the Holbrook family ecosystem. I closed the heavy black rings of the binder. They snapped shut with a loud metallic bite that echoed in the small room. I peeled the backing off a white adhesive label, picked up my black pen, and wrote the title in bold block letters, The Ledger. Below that, I added my full name, Sasha C. Holbrook, personal and confidential. I pressed the white label onto the front cover of the binder. I rested my palms flat against the cool black plastic. It was heavy. It possessed a physical, undeniable weight in my hands. $341,200. That was the exact cost of my invisibility. That was the staggering price I had paid for 9 years of enduring Sunday dinners at the wrong end of the table. Winifred loved to declare that family does not keep score. She used that phrase like a shield to protect herself from the burden of gratitude. Well, someone had kept the score. And the complete devastating score was now sitting right here in this folder. Later that same week, the quiet tension in our house finally began to crack. I was sitting at the mahogany desk in my home office updating a digital copy of the spreadsheet when Trevor's cell phone started to vibrate out in the living room. The low, steady buzzing sound rattled against the wooden coffee table. I stopped typing and listened. The phone buzzed until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds of absolute silence followed. Then it started vibrating again. I looked at the digital clock on my computer screen. Over the next 20 minutes, Trevor's phone rang 4 separate times. I sat perfectly still in my desk chair listening to the relentless mechanical vibration echoing through the thin drywall. Trevor was sitting on the living room sofa watching television, and he was deliberately ignoring every single call. When the phone started ringing for the 5th time, the pattern finally broke. I heard the heavy squeak of the sofa springs as Trevor stood up. His footsteps moved quickly across the hardwood floor. A second later, the heavy wooden door to the living room clicked firmly shut. I closed my laptop screen. The sudden darkness in my office amplified the muffled sounds coming through the wall. I could not make out every single word my husband was saying, but I could hear the panicked, rapid cadence of his voice. He sounded like a man desperately trying to calm down a cornered animal. "Mom," he said, the single syllable punching clearly through the drywall. A long pause followed, filled only by the faint hum of my desk lamp. Then his voice spiked higher. "It is not like that." Another heavy pause. "She did not." He repeated that last phrase 3 times in a row, the words tripping over each other in his haste to speak them. I leaned back in my chair. My heart maintained a slow, even rhythm. I did not feel the sudden spike of adrenaline that usually accompanies a crisis. I just felt incredibly tired. The living room door opened. Trevor walked down the short hallway and stopped in the open doorway of my office. I turned my chair to face him. His skin was completely devoid of color, holding a strange ashen pallor under the hallway light. He was gripping a glass of water in his right hand. His knuckles were bone white, the tendons straining against his skin as if the glass were the only thing keeping him tethered to the floor. I looked at his white knuckles, then moved my gaze up to his panicked eyes. "What did your mother want?" I asked. My voice was entirely flat, stripped of any curiosity or concern. Trevor swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just planning stuff for the dinner." I stared at him. I did not blink. I let the silence stretch out between us until it became a physical pressure in the room. "You do not lie well, Trevor," I told him, keeping my voice very quiet. "You never have." He shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. He looked down at the carpet, entirely unable to meet my eyes. "It is nothing you need to worry about," he mumbled to the floor. He turned around and walked up the carpeted stairs to the 2nd floor, leaving me sitting alone in the dark office. I turned my chair back toward the desk and placed my hand on the thick black spine of the binder. He was lying. It was a pathetic, transparent lie. Something massive had just happened regarding the cabin. I could tell by the desperate way he clutched that water glass, using it as a physical barrier between himself and the truth. Harold Ennis was a thorough attorney. The lawyer must have run the title search on the Ridgeline Trail property and immediately reported his findings to his client. Winifred now knew about the limited liability company. She knew my name was the only name on the corporate paperwork. And whatever absolute rage Winifred had just unleashed on her son over the phone, Trevor was actively choosing to hide it from me. He was choosing to protect his mother's narrative instead of defending his wife's reality. I did not follow him upstairs to demand an explanation. The answer to every question I had was already contained in his silence, and I had officially stopped waiting for him to find his courage. The next morning, the coastal humidity settled over Savannah like a wet blanket. I was sitting at the kitchen island drinking a cup of black coffee when Trevor walked down the stairs wearing his heavy work boots and a faded denim shirt. He did not look in my direction. He walked straight to the counter and picked up his car keys. "Mom needs help with something at the cabin," he announced to the empty space, hovering somewhere near the refrigerator. He did not turn his head to gauge my reaction. I took a sip of my coffee. "Okay," I said. He walked out the back door. The heavy hinges whined and the deadbolt clicked shut behind him. I listened to his truck engine roar to life in the driveway, the sound fading slowly as he drove down the street. I looked up at the round clock ticking on the kitchen wall. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Driving from our house in Savannah up into the Blue Ridge Mountains took a minimum of 90 minutes in each direction. I washed my coffee mug, dried it, and placed it in the cabinet. I moved into the living room, picked up a novel I had been trying to finish for 3 weeks, and sat down on the sofa. I read the same page 4 times without absorbing a single word. My mind was running the mathematics of my husband's journey. 90 minutes up the highway, 90 minutes back down. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the lock on the back door clicked open. 5 full hours had passed since he left. Factoring in the 3 hours of total drive time, that meant Trevor had stood inside that mountain cabin for 2 solid hours. I did not move from the sofa. I kept the open book resting in my lap. I watched him walk through the kitchen. He moved with a heavy, dragging exhaustion, as if he had just spent the entire morning carrying cinder blocks up a steep hill. He walked directly to the refrigerator. He pulled the stainless steel handle, opening the large door wide. The bright light from inside the fridge spilled across the kitchen floor. Trevor stood there, staring blankly at the shelves of milk, eggs, and leftover containers. He stood perfectly still for almost a full minute, not reaching for a single item. He was just staring into the cold air, completely lost in whatever emotional beating he had just endured. Finally, he pushed the heavy door shut. I closed my book. The soft thud of the paper pages falling together made him jump slightly. "How is your mother?" I asked from the living room. He kept his back turned to me, resting his hands flat on the edge of the granite counter. "Fine," he said, his voice completely hollow. I watched the tension radiating across his broad shoulders. "What did she need help with?" I pressed, keeping my tone mild and inquisitive. Trevor reached for a clean glass from the drying rack. He turned on the faucet and filled it with cold water. "Just the water heater," he replied, taking a slow sip. It was making a strange noise. The late afternoon sun was cutting through the kitchen window blinds, casting sharp, distinct horizontal shadows across the hardwood floor. The wall clock ticked with a relentless mechanical rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. I looked at the back of his faded denim shirt. I noticed the collar was badly wrinkled, pulled out of shape as if someone had grabbed him by the fabric and shaken him. I looked at the glass in his hand. The clear water was trembling, slightly small ripples moving across the surface from the violent shaking in his fingers. "The water heater I paid to install last March?" I asked. My voice was a perfectly calibrated instrument, carrying no anger, only an undeniable statement of fact. Trevor flinched. It was a tiny, microscopic jerk of his shoulders, but in the quiet kitchen, it was as loud as a gunshot. "Yeah," he whispered, staring down at the trembling water in his hand. "That one." The silence that followed was suffocating. I set my book down on the coffee table. I looked at my husband and I saw absolutely everything he was refusing to say. He had just driven 3 hours round trip to stand in the living room of a cabin that I owned. He had stood on the hardwood floors I purchased beneath the roof I repaired, and he had listened to his mother rage about my betrayal. Winifred knew about the corporate entity. Harold Ennis had told her the truth, and she had spent 2 hours screaming about the gold-digging woman who had stolen her family legacy. And whatever terrible, unforgivable things she had called me, Trevor had absorbed them. He had stood there, swallowed his mother's venom, and driven all the way back to Savannah just to stand in my kitchen and tell me a pathetic lie about a $2,800 water heater that was functioning perfectly. I could have pushed him. I could have walked into the kitchen, demanded the truth, and forced him to repeat every single word his mother had said. I could have screamed. I could have thrown a glass against the wall to break the unbearable quiet. But the terrifying reality was that I already knew the truth. The problem was not what Winifred Holbrook had said up on that mountain. The problem was what Trevor Holbrook had failed to say back. He had not defended me. He had not laid out the receipts. He had not mentioned the medical bills or the student loans. He had simply let her believe her own twisted narrative, because correcting her would require a spine he simply did not possess. I picked my book back up and opened it to a random page. I did not read the words. I just stared at the ink on the paper. Trevor remained standing in the kitchen, gripping his glass of water, utterly paralyzed by his own cowardice. We were 2 people standing in the exact same house, suffocating inside 2 entirely different silences. The chasm between us had cracked open deep and wide, and there was not enough money in the world to buy a bridge that could cross it. The oppressive silence of the weekend dragged itself all the way into Monday morning, following me out of the house and settling firmly into my office at Dalton & Associates. I did not attend services at the First Baptist Church up in Blue Ridge. I had never belonged to that congregation, and I certainly did not belong to the inner circle of women who gathered in the fellowship hall after the Sunday sermon. But malicious gossip always travels significantly faster than the speed limit down Interstate 515. I was sitting at my heavy mahogany desk. A ceramic mug of coffee sat near my left elbow, completely ignored and turning cold. Bright morning sunlight cut through the plastic window blinds, laying sharp white stripes across the scattering of financial documents spread across my workspace. I held a standard blue ballpoint pen in my right hand, methodically drafting preparation notes for a 10 o'clock client meeting. Everything in my professional world was orderly, predictable, and firmly under my control. Then my desk phone rang. The caller identification display showed the name Ida Purnell. She was the newly widowed client I had been helping pro bono for the past 3 months, patiently guiding her through the tangled mess of accounts her late husband had left behind. I picked up the receiver and offered my standard professional greeting. "Sasha, honey," Ida said. Her voice carried a heavy, nervous hesitation. It was the distinct cadence of a Southern woman preparing to deliver terrible news disguised as deep concern. "I was not going to say a single word, but I heard something at church yesterday and I really thought you should know." I stopped writing. I kept the blue pen hovering just above the yellow legal pad. "What did you hear, Ida?" She took a shaky breath. The line hissed faintly with static. Winifred Holbrook was speaking to the ladies' circle after the service. She told everyone that she found a terrible complication with her property. She said your name is on the deed to her mountain cabin because you manipulated the legal paperwork. Ida paused the silence, stretching out uncomfortably. She told the entire group that you forged the documents behind the family's back. The pen in my hand remained perfectly still. She said that at church I asked, my voice completely devoid of inflection. Right in the middle of the fellowship hall, Ida confirmed, sounding genuinely distressed. Dolores Campbell was standing right there, and Patty Greer and at least 6 other women from the committee. I stared at the white stripes of sunlight cutting across my desk. What exactly did my mother-in-law say? Ida lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She said you deliberately put your name on the deed without telling a single soul. She claimed you have been quietly positioning yourself to take their family legacy for years. She called you a gold digger, Sasha. She used those exact words again. But this time, she told everyone she had absolute proof from a lawyer. My fingers locked around the plastic barrel of the ballpoint pen. The plastic groaned under the sudden immense pressure. I squeezed the pen until the joints in my fingers ached. These were the exact same fingers that had calmly written a check for $84,000 to pay for the oncology treatments of the very woman currently standing in a church and calling me a common thief. I told Dolores that simply could not be right, Ida continued, her voice trembling with misplaced guilt. I know you, Sasha. You are a good person. But Winifred was just so incredibly convincing. She stood there and cried in front of everyone. I closed my eyes. Of course she cried. Winifred Holbrook cried the exact same way other people inhaled oxygen. She wept on command, always with an attentive audience, and always at the precise moment it would serve her narrative best. She wept loudly when Earl passed away, ensuring the community delivered warm casseroles to her door for 6 consecutive months. She wept with pride when Trevor graduated, soaking up a decade of praise for her supposedly flawless parenting. And now she was weeping about her cruel, manipulative daughter-in-law, expertly handing out pitchforks to the entire congregation. Thank you for telling me, Ida, I said, maintaining the perfectly level tone of a financial advisor closing out a routine transaction. You did the right thing. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. I did not say goodbye. For the first time in my professional career, I simply hung up the phone. I sat in the quiet office for a long time. The coffee in the ceramic mug was entirely cold. The blue pen still rested on the desk. The world outside my window looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes ago, but the foundation beneath my feet had completely vanished. 9 years of my dedicated silence had just been weaponized against me. I had always given my money in the dark so that no one in the Holbrook family would ever have to feel small or indebted. And Winifred had expertly used that exact same darkness to completely erase me, turning my generosity into a calculated crime. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Trevor's number. He answered on the 3rd ring. The loud, rhythmic pounding of a framing hammer echoed in the background, mixed with the roar of a diesel engine from his construction site. Hey, he said loudly over the noise. I did not offer a greeting. Your mother stood in the middle of the church fellowship hall yesterday and told the entire congregation I forged the deed to the cabin. The hammering in the background continued, but Trevor's breathing suddenly stopped. He fumbled with his phone, likely walking away from his crew to find a quiet corner of the dirt lot. She would not do that, he finally stammered. She did exactly that, I replied, my voice cutting through the cellular static like a razor blade. Ida Purnell just called my office. Ida, the grieving widow I have been helping for free for 3 months because her husband died, and she could not locate her own savings. Trevor said nothing. I listened to the heavy, ragged sound of him pulling air into his lungs. It was the specific breathing pattern of a man who suddenly realized he was trapped in a burning building of his own, desperately searching for a window he could not find. "Trevor," I said, pressing the phone harder against my ear. "I need a direct answer. Did you tell your mother that I bought the cabin with my own money?" The silence stretched out thick and heavy. "I told her," he whispered. She absolutely refused to believe me. "Did you tell her about her medical bills?" I asked. "No," he said. "Did you tell her about the $76,000 for your brother's student loans?" "No," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "Why?" The word was a single flat demand. "Because she is my mother, Sasha," he pleaded, leaning heavily into his favorite exhausted excuse. And she was already so upset. She was already what I demanded, the cold clarity finally taking total control of my tongue. Already calling me a thief to anyone who would listen. Already rewriting the history of our entire marriage. Already making me the absolute villain of a story where I am the only person who ever paid for anything. "Sasha, please let me just talk to her again." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, ending the call. I drove straight to Bree's apartment the moment my workday concluded. The coastal evening air was thick and humid, but I felt freezing cold. Bree opened her front door wearing a pair of faded cotton pajamas. She took one look at my face and stepped aside, pulling the door completely open without asking a single question. Her eyes communicated that she already knew a disaster had occurred. I walked into her living room and sat down heavily on the edge of the fabric sofa. The apartment smelled like lavender detergent and warm tea. Down the narrow hallway, the door to Ivy's bedroom was partially closed. The little girl was already asleep. For the first time since Ida Purnell called my office, my body betrayed the immense pressure I was holding. A fine, uncontrollable tremor moved through my shoulders. It was the physical shaking of a person who had been carrying a crushing weight for far too long, and suddenly had nowhere left to put it down. Bree sat down on the coffee table, directly in front of me, her knees almost touching mine. "So she finally went nuclear," Bree stated quietly. "She told the entire church congregation I forged the property deed," I whispered, staring down at my empty hands. Bree tilted her head. "And where exactly is Trevor in all of this?" "He told her the truth about the cabin yesterday," I said. She refused to believe him. He did not push the issue. He just let her keep screaming. And the massive medical bills, the student loans. He did not mention those at all. Bree reached out and placed her warm hands firmly over my shaking ones. She spoke with a slow, deliberate cadence, forcing me to hear the ugly truth. "Sasha, he is actively protecting her. He is not protecting you." "I know," I replied. The two words scraped against the back of my throat. "Then what exactly are you going to do about it?" she asked. I pulled my hands back and sat up straighter. The tremor in my shoulders slowly began to subside. "I do not know every detail yet," I admitted. "But I know exactly what I am not going to do. I am not going to call her. I am not going to drive up a mountain to explain myself to a woman who decided I was the enemy long before she knew a single true thing about me. I am done chasing acceptance from people who demand my money, but refuse to acknowledge my existence." Bree nodded slowly, a fierce light burning in her eyes. "Good. That is incredibly good. Now we need to talk about timing. The annual Holbrook Dinner is exactly 2 weeks from this Saturday. There will be at least 18 people gathered in that cabin. It is Winifred's favorite stage." Bree leaned closer. "What do you want to happen when you walk into that room?" I looked down at my hands again. The trembling was completely gone. The fingers that had signed away $341,000 were perfectly steady. "I want the absolute truth in that room," I said, my voice echoing with quiet, terrifying certainty. "All of it. Every single receipt. And I want everyone in her precious community to see it at the exact same time." The following 2 weeks transformed my house into a barren, hollow landscape. Trevor and I continued to exist under the same roof, but we were living in 2 entirely separate dimensions. We engaged in a silent, choreographed domestic routine designed specifically to avoid any meaningful contact. I would stand at the stove and cook dinner. He would wait until I left the room, then carry his plate to the sink and quietly wash his dishes. We did not discuss the cabin. We did not mention Winifred. We certainly did not speak about the church. At night, the massive king-size bed felt like a frozen continent. We lay on opposite edges of the mattress, leaving a vast expanse of white cotton sheets between us. That physical space was easily wide enough to hold 9 full years of suffocating silence. Trevor attempted to bridge the chasm exactly 1 time. It was late on a Thursday evening. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the granite countertops with a damp cloth. He stopped in the doorway, lingering near the light switch. He was wearing his gray sweatpants, looking exhausted and worn down. "Sasha," he began, his voice tentative and pleading. "Mom is just really scared right now. She simply does not understand how corporate paperwork functions." I did not stop wiping the counter. I did not turn around to look at his face. "She is not scared, Trevor," I said, throwing the damp cloth into the stainless steel sink. "She is deeply entitled. She believes the world owes her everything she demands." I turned around and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms over my chest. "And you are not confused about the situation. You are just a coward." Trevor flinched as if I had struck him across the face. He opened his mouth, but no words materialized. He simply stared at me, the devastating truth of my statement pinning him firmly to the doorframe. That was the absolute longest silence of our entire 9-year marriage. It stretched through the kitchen heavily, filling the space between the refrigerator and the stove. He did not sleep in the bed that night. He took a blanket from the hall closet and lay down on the living room sofa. I stayed in the bedroom, staring up at the dark ceiling. Neither of us closed our eyes. Neither of us walked down the hallway to check on the other person. The false peace was permanently shattered. The battle lines were drawn. Winifred was aggressively spreading her fabricated narrative across the entire county, poisoning the well of her community against me. Kyle had not sent a single text message or made a phone call since the night I refused to pay for his transmission repair. Trevor was entirely paralyzed by his lifelong terror of confronting his mother. I was completely alone. But as I lay in the dark room, listening to the faint hum of the central air conditioning, I realized something profoundly liberating. Being completely alone meant I no longer had to ask anyone for permission. I had the certified receipts. I had the recorded warranty deed. I had the heavy black binder sitting on my office desk. Winifred Holbrook had demanded a villain for her tragic story, and she was about to discover exactly what happens when you force a woman who keeps the financial records to play the part. I did not receive an invitation to the emergency family meeting held in Blue Ridge that Saturday afternoon. I would only learn the exact details of that gathering much later when Uncle Roy finally decided he could no longer stomach the bitter taste of his sister-in-law's fabricated outrage. But even as I sat alone in my quiet house in Savannah, hundreds of miles away, I could feel the immense, suffocating weight of Winifred Holbrook pulling her family ranks tightly together. Uncle Roy told me how Winifred had summoned everyone to the cabin living room. Trevor had driven up because his mother demanded his presence. Kyle had arrived looking confused. Roy, the older brother of my late father-in-law, sat in the corner armchair. He possessed a gravelly voice and a sharp, observant nature that made Winifred inherently nervous. He was the only person in the entire family who did not automatically yield to her theatrical displays. Winifred had stood by the stone fireplace, her hands clasped tightly together in a picture of maternal distress. According to Roy, she did not waste any time. She told her sons and her brother-in-law that they had a massive problem. She announced that I had secretly put my name on her cabin. Kyle had been genuinely shocked. He asked his mother if the cabin was not actually hers. Winifred had immediately raised her voice, insisting that the home belonged to her. She claimed I had done something incredibly shady behind her back, and that Harold Ennis had uncovered the terrible truth. Uncle Roy had leaned forward in his chair. He asked her exactly what the lawyer had said. Winifred had hesitated, clearly struggling to bend the absolute legal reality into her preferred narrative of victimization. She told them Harold found a limited liability company carrying my name. Roy had asked if the lawyer said this arrangement was illegal. Winifred had faltered again. She argued that while I might own the property on paper, paper did not tell the whole story. That was the exact moment my husband finally spoke up. Trevor told the room that I had purchased the cabin with my own money. The silence that followed must have been absolutely deafening. Kyle had stared at his brother. Uncle Roy had stared at Winifred. And Winifred had looked at Trevor with an expression of pure, unadulterated betrayal, as if he had just driven a knife directly into her spine. She completely dismissed Trevor's statement. She told her son that I had filled his head with lies, insisting that gold diggers always found a way to make men believe the money belonged to the woman. Trevor had opened his mouth to defend me, but his courage completely vanished before a single word could escape. He closed his mouth and looked down at his shoes. Uncle Roy had simply shaken his head, stood up from his armchair, and walked straight toward the front door. He told Winifred he was not getting in the middle of her mess, and he told her to sort it out herself. Roy walked out completely, removing the only potential ally Trevor could have leaned on. I did not know any of this when the headlights of Kyle's car swept across my front window on Saturday evening. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of cold water, when the heavy doorbell rang. Trevor was upstairs in the master bedroom with the door firmly closed. I walked through the living room and pulled the front door open. Kyle stood on the porch under the yellow glow of the security light. He was not smiling. His usually easy, charming demeanor was completely absent. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his denim jacket and looked at me with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and profound disappointment. He did not wait for an invitation to come inside. He stepped into the foyer and turned to face me. "Sasha, I am going to be entirely straight with you," Kyle said, his voice dropping into a low, serious register. "Mom is talking about getting a lawyer, a real litigator, not Harold Ennis. She wants to challenge the corporate paperwork." I took a slow sip of my water. The glass was cool against my fingers. She can certainly try, Kyle. She has absolutely no legal standing to challenge anything I own. Kyle shifted his weight, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the hardwood floor. "Maybe not. But she is telling everyone in the community that you took advantage of an old woman. And look, I know you have helped out over the years." I lowered the glass. Helped out. Two incredibly inadequate words summarizing almost a decade of total financial devotion. Kyle pressed on, completely oblivious to the sudden drop in the room's temperature. "But Mom has a valid point about the cabin. That place was always supposed to be a family place." I stared at my brother-in-law. I looked at his expensive sneakers, his designer jacket, and the absolute certainty in his eyes. He genuinely believed he was the reasonable mediator in this situation. "Kyle," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "do you have any idea who actually paid your student loans?" He blinked, clearly thrown by the sudden pivot in the conversation. "Trevor did," he answered immediately. "No," I replied, enunciating the single syllable with absolute precision. "I did. $76,000, transferred directly from my personal checking account. I have every single certified receipt." Kyle froze. The air in the foyer seemed to completely stall. I watched his brain attempt to process the mathematical reality of his own survival. I watched the realization dawn on his face that the gratitude he had so casually tossed at his brother actually belonged to the woman standing right in front of him. He looked away, his eyes scanning the blank wall near the staircase. Then he delivered the most devastating response I could have possibly imagined. "Well," Kyle muttered, his voice tightening defensively, "that was really nice of you. But that is between you and Trevor. The cabin is a family matter." I nodded slowly. The motion felt entirely mechanical. A family matter. $76,000 of my hard-earned money was simply a nice thing I did. The mountain cabin I purchased entirely with my premarital savings was a family matter. I was not family. I had never been family. I was just the incredibly convenient bank account that kept the Holbrook name afloat. Kyle turned around and walked out the front door without another word. I listened to his car engine start, the tires pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the humid Savannah night. I walked slowly back into the kitchen and sat down at the island. I looked up at the ceiling. Trevor was still upstairs. He had undoubtedly heard the doorbell. He had almost certainly heard his brother's voice echoing in the foyer. But he had not come down the stairs. He had stayed hidden in the bedroom, letting me face the consequences of his lifelong silence entirely alone. The next morning, the sky above Savannah was pale and clear, but my mind was entirely consumed by a heavy, suffocating fog. I left the house before 7 o'clock. I did not wake Trevor. I did not leave a note on the kitchen counter. I just took my car keys and started driving north, following the highway away from the coast and up toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. I drove for nearly 4 hours without turning on the radio. When I finally reached Highway 515, the morning fog rolling across the mountain peaks was incredibly thick. It swallowed the deep valleys, leaving only the highest ridges floating above a vast ocean of white mist. I pulled my car onto a gravel overlook. This was the exact same scenic stop where I had parked 7 years ago, right before I drove into town to sign the closing papers for the cabin. I turned the engine off. The sudden silence inside the vehicle was deafening. I looked down at the silver Timex watch on my wrist. 7:12 in the morning. Right now, Winifred was likely waking up in her master bedroom, picking out a pastel cardigan to wear to the First Baptist Church. Right now, Trevor was probably lying in our bed in Savannah, pretending to be asleep so he would not have to acknowledge my absence. Right now, Kyle was probably sleeping off his Saturday night, completely unbothered by the crushing weight of the debt he no longer had to carry. And I was sitting entirely alone in a cold car, staring out at a mountain that I had literally purchased for them. I leaned forward and opened the glove box. I pushed aside a stack of registration papers, and pulled out my small spiral-bound notebook. I clicked on the overhead cabin light. The yellow illumination washed over the handwritten pages. This was not my financial ledger. The binder on my desk at home contained the exact numbers, the rigid mathematics of my financial bleeding. But this little notebook contained something far more devastating. It held the precise accounting of my emotional wounds. I flipped the pages slowly, reading the brief, terrible notes I had scribbled in the dark over the past 9 years. February of 2020. Winifred said, "At least you are useful in the kitchen." Trevor laughed. August of 2021. Kyle's graduation party. Winifred introduced me to 23 different people as Trevor's wife. She did not use the name Sasha a single time. December of 2022. Christmas morning. Winifred gave everyone personalized engraved gifts. I received a generic vanilla candle from a mall store. The yellow discount sticker was still firmly attached to the bottom of the glass. November of 2024. The Thanksgiving toast. She raised her glass to her boys who built this family. I sat alone in the kitchen washing the serving platters. Nobody noticed I was missing from the table. I kept 2 very different ledgers. One tracked the money. One tracked the profound disrespect. The financial numbers added up to $341,200. But the wounds in this notebook possessed no calculated value. There was absolutely no spreadsheet capable of measuring the quiet, crushing agony of sitting at a dining table you paid for only to be repeatedly told you did not belong in the room. I closed the notebook. I looked out through the windshield at the thick white fog. The mountain was still out there, solid and unmovable, even though I could not see it. My mother's voice echoed in the quiet space of the car. "Don't be like me, baby. Don't give everything and keep nothing." I pressed my forehead against the cold steering wheel. "You told me not to be like you, Mama," I whispered to the empty car. "But you accidentally taught me a terrible lesson. You taught me that invisible women build the world, and highly visible women happily take all the credit for it. You built a beautiful home that nobody ever remembered to thank you for. I bought a mountain cabin that nobody even knows is mine. The only difference between us is that I still have enough time left to force them to see me." My cell phone vibrated violently in the cup holder, shattering the quiet moment. I picked it up. Bree's name glowed on the screen. I swiped to answer and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hey, Bree," said gently. "How are you doing today?" I took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am currently sitting on top of a mountain that I paid for," I replied. "I am thinking about how my dead mother begged me not to become invisible, and how I spent the last 9 years doing exactly that." Bree paused. "That sounds like either a massive breakthrough or a total breakdown. Can it not be both?" I asked. Bree let out a short, authentic laugh. I almost smiled. "Listen to me," Bree said, her voice dropping its usual sharp edge and adopting a tone of fierce loyalty. "The annual dinner is next Saturday. There will be 18 people sitting around that table. Sasha, whatever you decide to do, you need to do it entirely for you. Do not do it for Winifred. Do not do it to punish Trevor. Do not even do it for Ruby Cole. You do this for you." I looked out the window. The thick fog was finally beginning to lift, dissolving into the warming morning air. The deep green valley slowly revealed itself below the overlook. The cabin was located somewhere down there, nestled among the ancient oak trees. It was my cabin. I promised her. I ended the call. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I did not drive down the mountain toward the cabin. I turned the car around and drove straight back to Savannah. I did not go home. I drove directly to the commercial printing center. I walked inside and stood before the massive copy machine once again. I took out my master ledger summary, the single devastating page that clearly listed every single dollar, every single recipient, and the grand total of $341,200. I printed exactly 18 copies, one for every single person who would be sitting at Winifred Holbrook's table next Saturday night. I bought a large, heavy manila envelope from the front counter. I carefully slid the 18 copies of the financial summary inside. I placed the certified copy of the warranty deed right on top of the stack. I sealed the metal clasp. I picked up a thick black marker. I wrote 2 enormous words across the front of the envelope. The ledger. The false piece was officially over. I was finally ready for the dinner. The digital clock on my computer screen shifted from 1:59 to exactly 2:00 in the morning. The house was entirely silent. It was a thick, suffocating kind of quiet that only happens in the dead of night when the rest of the world has completely shut down. From the living room down the hall, the faint, rhythmic sound of Trevor breathing drifted through the open doorway. It was his 3rd consecutive night sleeping on the downstairs sofa. He had not offered an explanation for abandoning our bed, and I had not asked for one. We were currently operating under a fragile truce constructed entirely out of avoidance. I sat at my mahogany desk in the home office. The single desk lamp cast a tight circle of yellow illumination across the dark wood. My mother's silver Timex watch lay flat on the center of the desk, right where I had unclasped it an hour ago. Beside the watch sat a small square photograph resting in a silver frame. It was the only picture of Ruby Cole I kept in my workspace. It was not a formal portrait or a carefully posed family holiday card. It was a candid snapshot taken in the cramped, poorly lit kitchen of our old house in Macon, Georgia. In the photo, my mother was wearing a faded white apron over a floral dress. Her hands were coated in a fine layer of white baking flour. She was looking just past the camera, offering a smile that was undeniably genuine, but carried a bone-deep exhaustion she could never quite hide. I stared at that flour-dusted smile for a very long time. The yellow light of the desk lamp reflected off the glass frame. "You died in that kitchen, Mama," I whispered to the empty room. She had not died there, literally. The cancer took her in a sterile hospital bed 3 years after that photograph was taken. But the woman she was supposed to be had died in that kitchen, long before her body failed. She died on the Tuesday evening my father came home from the plant, walked right past the new floral curtains she had spent 3 weeks sewing by hand, and never said a single word about them. She died a little more on the day my older brother moved out to the coast, and somehow forgot to call her for 6 solid months. She died every single time when she cooked a massive turkey for 14 extended relatives, served everyone on her best china, and then ate her own dinner, standing up near the stove because there were not enough chairs, and she had instinctively given hers away. I watched her fade. I watched her slowly and quietly erase herself. It was the specific way good, compliant women were expected to disappear in this country. Not with a dramatic exit or a loud argument, but with a warm casserole dish in each hand and absolutely no one around to say thank you. Lying in that hospital bed with her skin turning pale and her breathing growing incredibly shallow, she had gripped my hand. Her fingers had felt like dry autumn leaves. "Do not be like me, baby," she had told me. "Do not give everything away, and keep nothing for yourself." They were the last words she ever spoke to me that actually carried any weight. And I had promised her. I had squeezed her frail hand and sworn I would never let myself become invisible. I leaned back in my leather desk chair and looked at the heavy black binder resting on the corner of my desk. 41 certified receipts. 9 years of Sunday dinners sitting at the absolute worst end of the table near the swinging kitchen door. A beautiful mountain cabin that I legally owned but someone else proudly called her ancestral home. A husband who loved me the way people love a reliable appliance, comfortably and without a second thought, right up until the moment it stops working the way they expect. I reached out and picked up the silver Timex. The metal was cold against my palm. I turned it over and traced my thumb across the engraving on the back plate. The letters RC followed by the words, "Keep time, keep faith." Ruby Cole had purchased this watch with her very first paycheck from the textile mill. She had worn it every single day for 31 years. "I have been keeping the time, Mama," I thought, running my thumb over the scratched metal. 9 years of it. I kept track of every single dollar, every quiet slight, every calculated insult Winifred threw across the dinner table, every cowardly silence Trevor retreated into, but the faith part of the engraving was gone. I did not know what I had kept faith in. The Holbrook family was never mine to begin with, and my marriage was currently sleeping on a living room sofa because my husband was too terrified of his own mother to defend the woman he married. I set the watch back down on the desk. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman in the photograph. "The main difference between you and me is not that I am smarter or braver. The difference is that I possess the proof. You gave every piece of yourself away and kept absolutely nothing to show for it. No records, no receipts, no documentation. You simply trusted that love would be enough to make people remember your sacrifices. It was not. I would not make that same mistake. Not because I was inherently better than her, but because I was her daughter, and she had accidentally taught me exactly what happens when you leave your legacy in the hands of ungrateful people." I picked up the Timex watch. I wrapped the cold metal band around my left wrist and snapped the clasp shut. I adjusted it so it sat tighter than usual against my skin. It felt like tying a physical promise directly to my pulse. I opened my laptop one final time. The screen woke up, casting a cool blue glow across the dark office. I opened the spreadsheet. I did not type anything. I simply scrolled down through the 9 years of data, every single line item, every date, every staggering amount of money. The final total of $341,200 sat in bold black font at the very bottom. I did not need to add a single penny. I did not need to remove anything. It was a complete, undeniable record of my existence. I closed the laptop screen. I reached over and clicked off the yellow desk lamp. The office went pitch black. I did not go upstairs to the empty king-size bed. I walked quietly down the hallway, stepped into the kitchen, and turned on the small light above the stove. I measured out the coffee grounds, filled the reservoir with water, and pressed the brewing button. Then I sat down at the granite kitchen island, folded my hands together, and waited for the sun to rise. When Trevor finally walked into the kitchen, the wall clock showed exactly 6 in the morning. The pale yellow light of a humid Georgia morning was just beginning to push through the east-facing windows. He stopped just inside the doorway. He looked terrible. His eyes were red and heavily swollen from 3 nights of terrible sleep. His hair stood up at odd angles, and he was wearing a faded gray cotton shirt that hung loosely from his broad shoulders. He looked at me sitting at the island. Then he looked at the 2 ceramic mugs of hot black coffee resting on the granite counter. Finally, his eyes landed on the object, sitting exactly halfway between the 2 coffee mugs. It was a thick manila envelope. Across the front, I had written the words, "The Ledger," in thick black ink. "Sit down," I told him. My voice was completely calm, devoid of any anger or morning grogginess. "I am going to show you something, and then you are going to make a choice." Trevor did not argue. He walked slowly across the kitchen floor, his bare feet making no sound against the hard wood. He pulled out the tall wooden stool opposite me and sat down. He wrapped both of his hands around the warm coffee mug, using it as an anchor. He stared at the envelope but made absolutely no move to touch it. "Open it," I instructed. He took a short, uneven breath. He let go of his coffee mug, reached across the granite, and hooked his finger under the metal clasp of the envelope. He pulled the flap open and slid the stack of heavy paper out onto the counter. The very first page was the single-sheet summary. A clean, aggressively organized list. Date, recipient, amount. I watched his bloodshot eyes scan down the crisp white page. I knew the exact moment he hit the largest numbers. His reading pace suddenly stopped. His shoulders went completely rigid. I watched his eyes lock onto the line, indicating $84,000 paid directly to the oncology billing department. The money that had saved Winifred from drowning in medical debt when her premium insurance policy rejected her experimental treatments. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. His eyes moved down 3 lines. $76,000. Kyle's student loans. The money that stopped the collection agencies from garnishing his younger brother's restaurant wages. The money Kyle had called to thank him for. His eyes tracked further down. $12,400 for the cabin roof replacement last October. Then his gaze hit the bold black number at the very bottom of the page. "I knew about most of this," Trevor whispered. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "You knew," I agreed, keeping my tone perfectly level. "But you never saw it all in one place." Trevor blinked rapidly, staring at the bottom of the page as if the ink might suddenly rearrange itself into a less devastating truth. 341,000. And 200, I corrected him immediately. "Do not round down my life." "Sasha," he started, his voice cracking on the second syllable of my name. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading for some kind of relief. "I am not done," I told him, cutting off whatever apology he was desperately trying to construct. "Turn the page." His hand was trembling slightly when he lifted the summary sheet and placed it to the side. The second document was the certified copy of the warranty deed. Holbrook Haven Limited Liability Company. Sole member Sasha C. Holbrook. He stared at the legal boundaries of the mountain property his mother claimed as her ancestral legacy. Then he turned the page again. The third page was the first of 18 notarized bank statements. The bright yellow highlighter ink stood out violently against the white paper, illuminating the exact checking account ending in 4471. A checking account that carried only my name. An account opened 3 full years before I ever walked down the aisle and became a Holbrook. Trevor dropped his hands to his lap. He could not look at the rest of the receipts. I watched his broad chest rise and fall with rapid, shallow breaths. For 9 years, whenever a difficult conversation arose, Trevor's instinct was to immediately locate a glass of water, hold it tightly, and use the act of drinking to avoid speaking. He had no glass right now. He only had the crushing weight of $341,200 resting on the counter between us. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. He kept his eyes fixed on the granite countertop, entirely unable to meet my gaze. "The annual dinner is this Saturday," I stated. There will be 18 people sitting around that long wooden table. Your mother will be there. Kyle will be there. Dolores and the Campbells will be there. Uncle Roy is driving up from Atlanta. Every single person your mother has been actively telling that I am a manipulative gold digger will be in that room. You want to show them, he said, the realization finally dawning on him. I want the absolute truth in the room, I replied. Every single dollar, every single receipt, every single year of my marriage. Trevor finally looked up. Mom will lose her mind, he whispered, the ingrained terror of Winifred's wrath instantly surfacing. Your mother has been standing in church fellowship halls telling her entire community that I stole from this family, I said, leaning slightly forward on my stool. I did not steal anything, Trevor. I built this family. I bought the roof over her head. I bought your brother's freedom from debt. I bought the very ground she stands on when she insults me. And if you cannot stand next to me while I prove it to them, then I need to know that right now. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. It was the kind of silence that permanently alters the trajectory of a life. I watched the internal war play out across my husband's exhausted face. I watched him process the absolute reality of what I had given his family. He was looking at a woman who had quietly bled her own savings dry to protect the people who treated her like an inconvenient servant, and he had let it happen. He had watched me write the checks. He had watched me sit at the wrong end of the table. He had listened to his mother diminish my existence for 9 years, and he had done absolutely nothing to stop it because he was fundamentally terrified of conflict. He was looking at the undeniable proof that he had failed me in every way a husband could possibly fail a wife without actually leaving the house. Trevor stood up from the wooden stool. He did not walk out the back door. He did not retreat to the living room sofa. He walked slowly around the granite island until he was standing directly next to me. He did not try to pull me into a hug. He knew I would not allow it. Instead, a man who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall slowly dropped down onto his knees on the hard kitchen floor right beside my chair. He looked up at me. His red eyes were completely wet. Saturday, he said, his voice breaking completely. I will be there. And I will not hold a glass this time. I looked down at the man I had married. The man I had loved enough to endure almost a decade of quiet humiliation. The man I had nearly lost to his own paralyzing cowardice. You do not get to hold a glass, I told him quietly. You get to hold the envelope. The next 48 hours moved with a strange mechanical precision. I functioned entirely on professional autopilot. On Thursday afternoon during my lunch break, I walked into the commercial printing center for the final time. I paid a high premium to have 18 complete sets of the ledger summary printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. I meticulously slid each individual packet into a clear plastic protective sleeve. It was an incredibly organized, pristine presentation. It looked exactly like the comprehensive financial portfolios I handed to my wealthiest clients. That was intentional. I was a financial planner and I was going to deliver the destruction of Winifred Holbrook's fabricated reality with absolute professional execution. On Friday evening, I was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when I heard Trevor's voice coming from the living room. He had his cell phone pressed to his ear. I stopped the knife and listened quietly. Yes, Mom, we are still driving up tomorrow afternoon, Trevor said. His tone was remarkably steady. A long pause followed as Winifred spoke through the receiver. I could not hear her words, but I could easily guess the question based on the sudden tightening of my husband's jaw. She is my wife, Trevor replied, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a firm edge I had never heard him use with her before. Of course she is coming. He ended the call without waiting for her response. He walked into the kitchen, looked at me standing by the cutting board and offered a single tight nod. The battle lines were officially drawn. Later that night, after Trevor went upstairs to shower, I picked up my cell phone and dialed his number. She answered immediately, the sound of a television playing softly in the background of her apartment. Saturday, I told her, keeping my voice low. I will not call you while it is happening. I will call you after it is done. I know, Bree said gently. I will be up. I will keep my phone right next to me. I ended the call and walked over to the small wooden table in our front hallway. The heavy manila envelope sat perfectly centered on the dark wood waiting for tomorrow morning. I stared at the bold black letters spelling out, the ledger. 18 people. 9 years of silence. $341,200. All contained inside one single envelope. I walked upstairs and opened my closet to select my clothes for the dinner. I did not choose the pastel colors Winifred always preferred. I reached for my tailored navy blue blazer, a crisp white silk blouse, and a pair of perfectly fitted black trousers. I selected a pair of practical black leather flat shoes. I looked at the jewelry box resting on my dresser. I bypassed the delicate gold necklaces and the pearl earrings Trevor had bought me for our 5th anniversary. I would wear my wedding ring, and I would wear Ruby Cole's silver Timex watch. Absolutely nothing else. I smoothed my hand over the dark navy fabric of the blazer. I was not dressing for a family dinner. I was not dressing for a war. I was dressing to deliver the undeniable truth, and there was a profound difference between the three. The cabin dining room was suffocatingly warm, packed with 18 people for the annual Holbrook Dinner, a tradition dating back to when Earl was still alive. Winifred had spent the day cooking her signature chicken casserole, the aroma of butter and sage filling the room. The solid oak table bearing the feast was the exact one I had purchased with my own money 5 years ago. I sat in my usual spot at the end of the table near the kitchen door. Trevor sat to my left, while Kyle sat across from us charming his girlfriend. The rest of the table included the Campbells, the Greers, Dolores from the church, and Harold Ennis, the lawyer Winifred had specifically invited as a witness for the theatrical execution she had planned for me. The dinner proceeded with a chaotic rhythm of silver scraping against porcelain. Everything looked the same as it had for 8 years except for 2 things. My eyes were calm and Trevor was not holding a water glass. His hands rested flat on his thighs right next to the heavy manila envelope tucked under his chair. When the main courses were cleared, Winifred stood and silenced the room by tapping her glass. She spoke of the Holbrook tradition and her role in keeping the family together. Then her tone dropped into maternal sorrow as she addressed ugly rumors about her home. She looked squarely at me, declaring that no piece of paper changed who the cabin belonged to. She accused me of marrying into the family only to try and take their legacy. In the absolute silence that followed, I counted 3 beats. I looked at Trevor. He gave a firm nod, stood to his full height, and slid the manila envelope down the center of the table toward his mother. "Open it, Mom," Trevor said, his voice flat and authoritative. Winifred's hands shook as she pulled out the summary sheet. I watched her eyes lock onto the massive numbers, $84,000, $76,000, and the grand total at the bottom. "That is 9 years, Winifred," I said, my voice level and professional. "Every dollar I gave this family. The treatment you told the church insurance covered. The loans Kyle thanked Trevor for. And the cabin." The atmosphere shifted violently. I instructed her to turn to the second page, the warranty deed for Holbrook Haven LLC with me as the sole member. I had bought the cabin with my premarital savings and paid for every mortgage, tax bill, and repair. Kyle pulled the ledger from his mother's shaking hands, his face draining of color as he saw the payment source for his loans, my personal account. He stared at the wood, silenced by the weight of his unearned salvation. Winifred, in a desperate rage, claimed I could have made it all up. I countered by pointing to the 18 notarized bank statements on page 3, offering a privacy waiver so she could cross-reference them. Harold Ennis cleared his throat and informed Winifred that if the documentation was accurate, she had no legal standing to contest the ownership or include the property in a will. Uncle Roy rumbled a question into the silence, asking Winifred if she had ever bothered to ask where the money came from. "I think that fact says something terrible about all of us," he added. The dinner broke up in minutes. The Campbells left in rushed silence, though Mr. Campbell whispered an apology. Harold Ennis apologized to me as well. I stepped onto the porch where Kyle was staring into the dark. He admitted he had thanked Trevor for the money. I told him I hadn't done it for a thank you, but because he was terrified and needed help. I only wanted him to know who actually provided it. He nodded in quiet understanding and left. It was more acknowledgement than I had received in 9 years. Inside, Trevor stood in the doorway while Winifred sat alone among 18 dirty plates. I left the cabin, leaving Trevor to clear the mess and finally face his mother. I drove down the mountain, the car feeling incredibly light. I stopped at the overlook, seeing the valley lights below. I called Bree and told her everything. Bree reminded me that I was never disappearing. I was just standing in a room of people who didn't know how to open their eyes. Looking at my Timex watch, I realized I hadn't done this for revenge. I did it because silence carries a cost. I was the only one paying. I had kept a ledger because I was afraid that without proof, no one would believe I was there at all. When I returned home, I found Trevor at the kitchen sink washing dishes. He told me his mother hadn't said a word after I left. I stood next to him at the sink, and for the first time in 9 years, it was enough. Winifred was right that families shouldn't keep score, but someone had to. As you watch Sasha hang her keys in the Savannah hallway and stand in the shared silence with Trevor, the heavy black binder on the desk remains a testament to a life nearly lost to the shadows. The ledger served its purpose on that mountain, but the story of a woman's worth is rarely finished with a single confrontation. To truly honor the legacy of Ruby Cole and the hard-won clarity of Sasha's journey, we propose a spin-off narrative that follows the ripple effect of the truth once the shouting stops, and the morning light hits the reality of a reconstructed life. The morning after the annual Holbrook dinner, the Savannah kitchen feels different. The air is no longer thick with the unsaid, and the granite island, the one paid for in 2021, is just a cold piece of stone again. Sasha wakes up and realizes that while she reclaimed her property and her name, she is now a woman standing in the middle of a beautiful, expensive house with a husband who finally knows how to wash a dish but still doesn't quite know how to look her in the eye. The spin-off titled The Second Ledger shifts the focus from financial reclamation to the messy, essential work of emotional reconstruction. The story follows Sasha as she receives a letter 3 weeks later, not from Winifred, but from a woman in Blue Ridge she barely knows, Nicole, Kyle's new girlfriend. Nicole saw the envelope hit the table. She saw the way a woman's 9-year sacrifice was treated as a family matter, rather than a life-saving miracle. Nicole is young, 32, and currently paying for Kyle's expensive dinners while her own savings account dwindles. She asks Sasha a single, terrifying question: how do I stop before I become you? This narrative creates a bridge of mentorship and caution. Sasha, once the silent giver, becomes the vocal advisor. She doesn't just manage millions in client portfolios at Dalton and Associates anymore. She begins a quiet underground network for the women of the Georgia coast who are funding lives that aren't theirs. The lesson is no longer about proving your past, but about protecting your future. It teaches you that the greatest act of love you can offer a family is not your total erasure, but your firm presence as a person with boundaries. As Sasha sits across from Nicole in a small coffee shop, she doesn't offer a spreadsheet. She offers a mirror. She explains that being good is not the same as being invisible, and that a man who loves you will never ask you to disappear so his mother can feel comfortable. The story deepens the theme of generational healing, showing that Sasha didn't just break the promise to Ruby Cole. She started a new one for every woman who ever felt like a footnote in her own marriage. The spin-off concludes with Sasha returning home to find Trevor hasn't just washed the dishes, but has finally taken the Holbrook name off the mailbox of the cabin, replacing it with the name of the LLC Sasha built. It is a small gesture, but it is the first time he has chosen the truth over the tradition. Think about the women in your own circle who are currently contributing little things while secretly holding up the world. Have you ever seen a younger woman following in your footsteps of overgiving and felt the desperate urge to pull her back and tell her your story? If you could go back to the first year of your own ledger, what is the one piece of advice you would give your younger self about the difference between being a partner and being a provider? We invite you to share the lessons you've learned in the comments, because sometimes the only way to stop a legacy of silence is to start a legacy of truth. As you sit in the quiet aftermath of Sasha's journey, looking at the digital clock on your own wall or the steam rising from your coffee, you might find yourself reflecting on the invisible ledgers you have been keeping in your own life. There is a profound, almost sacred beauty in the kind of quiet, sacrificial love that so many women offer, the type of generosity that doesn't ask for a spotlight or a thank you note. However, this story serves as a vital, practical lesson that there is a razor-thin line between being a pillar of strength for your family and becoming a ghost in your own home. You have likely been taught that love is measured by how much you can endure without complaining and how many fires you can put out without anyone ever knowing you held the hose. But Sasha's realization on that Blue Ridge overlook is one we must all face. Silence is not always an act of grace. Sometimes silence is simply a way of giving others permission to erase your worth. The most immediate educational takeaway from the wreckage of the Holbrook family is that your value is not a variable that depends on someone else's gratitude. If you are waiting for an entitled person to finally wake up one morning and thank you for the debts you've cleared, the health you've restored, or the roof you've kept over their heads, you are waiting for a day that may never appear on the calendar. Entitlement acts as a psychological blindfold. People like Winifred or Kyle do not see your sacrifice as a gift, but as a natural debt you owe them simply for the privilege of being in their orbit. When you give until you are empty to those who feel entitled to your fullness, you aren't building a family legacy, you are funding your own disappearance. You must learn that documentation is not an act of malice, nor is it a lack of faith in your loved ones. It is a fundamental act of self-preservation. In a world that often benefits from the unpaid and unacknowledged labor of women, keeping track of your contributions, whether they are financial, emotional, or physical, is the only way to ensure the truth cannot be rewritten by those with a louder voice and a more convenient memory. Sasha didn't organize her receipts because she wanted to destroy her family. She organized them because she realized that without proof, Her 9 years of devotion would be twisted into a narrative of greed by the very people who lived off her bank account. You have every right to stand in the light of your own accomplishments and refuse to let anyone call your generosity a contribution of little things. Sasha's final confrontation at the dinner table was a masterclass in reclaiming a stolen identity. It teaches you that you do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep people warm who wouldn't even offer you a seat at the table. True family shouldn't keep score, but if you find yourself in a situation where your kindness is being used as a weapon against you, do not be afraid to open that envelope and show the world the receipts of your life. You owe it to yourself, and you owe it to the memory of the women like Ruby Cole, who came before you, to stop being the invisible foundation and start being the owner of the house you built. As we close this chapter, I want you to take a deep breath and think about the roles you play in your own circles. Have you ever felt that cold, hollow realization that you are the only one paying the emotional and financial price for a family peace that doesn't actually include you? Have you ever watched a loved one take credit for your hard work, while you sat quietly at the wrong end of the table, afraid that speaking up would make you the villain? If you were to open your own ledger today, what is the one sacrifice you've made that you most wish someone would finally look you in the eye and acknowledge? Please share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. Let's create a space where no one has to be invisible anymore, because your story and your worth deserves to be seen by more than just the ink on a page.